We're here, we're queer, and we love the Lord. That's right, you're listening to Coming Out Christian, a podcast about life at the intersection of queer identity and Christian faith. This fun, faithful, and sometimes irreverent podcast is a production of Love Boldly, an Ohio-based nonprofit creating spaces where LGBTQIA+ people can flourish in Christianity. I'm one of your hosts, Siobhan Boyd-Nelson, and my co-host is the Reverend Dr. Ben Huelskamp, Executive Director of Love Boldly. So join us, and let's find out who's coming out today. Well, look there. It's Ben.
Hey, how are you, Siobhan?
I am doing wonderfully. It's great to see you. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. Hopefully enjoying, as again, we're recording into the future, hopefully enjoying what I hope will be a nice spring day in early May. That's not exactly the same weather that we have at the moment in Ohio, but hopefully will be when this episode airs.
Yeah, we can only dream as we prepare for a snowstorm at the time of recording that at the time of release, we will be in a much, much better position. I found myself daydreaming about sunshine this morning upon waking and finding yet another cold, wintry Ohio day.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
But anyway, we can dream and hope.
Yes, we can. But speaking of cold, wintry Ohio days, those are one of the things that can bring tears to our eyes, I think, sometimes. And we think about, the warmth that we are not experiencing, the frigid temperatures, the ice, the snow, the line at the grocery store as we all stock up for what could be anywhere from a dusting to 6 inches of snow, as always. But because of who our guest is today, and because I was having these, sad thoughts of winter weather, it occurred to me, when was the last time I cried? Like, when was the last time I cried? And I'm still thinking about it. I don't know that I have actually figured it out. I'm really trying to pinpoint it. Ben, do you know when the last time you cried was?
Ooh. So I'm going to quickly answer this two ways.
Okay.
First, the last time I happy cried was just this past Saturday.
Oh, that's right.
My new nephew Henry was born actually on Friday, but I got to meet him for the first time on Saturday, and I am definitely a sucker for little babies.
Oh, yeah.
And I am, as listeners who know me will already know, I am very much a doting uncle and gunkle.
Yes.
So yeah, I wasn't full on tears, but it was a nice moment. They were happy tears. Holding this tiny little baby, this little about 7.5 pound baby with the cutest little fingers and the cutest little nose. He's so darling. So those were happy tears. I think the last time I had sad tears was probably, I don't know how long it's been, a month or two ago, just about what's going on in the world and, where I am personally and professionally and whatever else. And not to say that I'm in a bad place in those ways, but just the kind of the weight of everything just, falling, seeming like it's falling down around me, just landed me, lying in bed, crying my eyes out. In probably a way that was very cathartic in the moment, but nevertheless not really all that pleasant.
No,
what about you?
I hear you. I hear you there. Happy tears are always welcome. I love happy tears. And I, more than even happy tears, because I tend to giggle when I'm happy, but I have a very emotional reaction to art and to music. So I think the last time I came close to tearing up was just over the holiday break. My wife and I, as we were sojourning across the South, we stopped in a bunch of art galleries and really focused on finding Black artists from the South and
Mm.
seeing their work. And some of it was just so beautiful. It really, truly was tear invoking. And that's always, it's almost a scary feeling. It's like, oh no, I can't cry over art. That would be too much, right? Like, you're doing too much, girl. Calm down.
No, no.
But I would consider those happy tears. It is definitely,
Sure.
I think, a happy emotion. Um, but then I think sad tears, I wouldn't even say sad tears. You know, podcasts make me cry, Ben. I don't know if that's because of the podcast I'm choosing to listen to. I love to learn things via podcast. And if I had to guess, the latest podcast that made me cry is a series that I'm listening to about Fela Kuti, and the Afrobeat pioneer and
Mm.
advocate and activist in Nigeria. And I'm learning so much. And a lot of it has been very emotional to learn, especially in this way. It's kind of like, oh, why didn't I know this? But good,
Mm.
good. But yeah, podcasts make me cry. Now everybody knows something more about me. Well, Ben, the reason I ask you about when was the last time you cried is because I think our guest knows a little bit something about that. And so I'm very, very excited to have him here with us today. Our guest is the Reverend Benjamin Perry, who is an ordained minister and the author of Crybaby: Why Our Tears Matter. He is an award winning writer, and his work has appeared in The Atlantic, The Washington Post, Slate, Religion News Service, and more. And their work has appeared in outlets like the BBC, Time, NPR, and 10% Happier. They live in Maine, where they serve on the board of OUTMaine, woohoo, offer queer theology trainings in local congregations, and serve as the director of communications at Garrett Seminary. Welcome, 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 Reverend Benjamin Perry. Thank you so much for being here.
It's such a delight to be here. Thanks so much, Siobhan, Ben.
Yes, yes. Well, we are going to get started with the first question we ask all of our guests. What is your testimony? What is your story at the intersection of queer identity and Christian faith?
So I'll be honest that question gives me a little pause only because I'm not from a religious tradition where testimony is a thing. I'm a strong mainline Presbyterian. And I think if anybody had asked somebody in my home church what their testimony was, they would have run out of the building screaming.
Do your
So
best.
I'm gonna frame this around some things I know to be true. The first thing that I know to be true is that I was created good, wondrous, and holy exactly as I am. And I say this and I start my testimony with that truth because for the longest time, that's not how I felt about myself.
Yeah.
I have so many memories of being a child, awakening to my own gender identity, my own sexuality, and feeling so potently uncomfortable in my own skin.
Mm-hmm.
I write in my book a little bit about some of these moments that were totally innocuous to somebody else, but they brought me to face parts of myself that I certainly wasn't ready to share with other people, but I really wasn't ready to share with myself either.
Mm-hmm.
And what's ironic about that, compared to so many queer folks who grew up in homophobic churches or other communities where they were explicitly taught to denigrate or hate parts of themselves, I actually grew up in a pretty affirming church. It wasn't a church that particularly celebrated queer people, but my minister took some really big stands on ordaining queer elders at a time when that wasn't allowed in the Presbyterian Church.
Wow.
And certainly I never heard a sermon that was homophobic or talked about LGBTQIA plus people in any way. But the unfortunate reality is that I also grew up in a country where that was not the only religious voice that I was hearing. And so absent a theology of celebration and affirmation in my home community, the only message that I heard about queer folks were the larger church voices that were speaking, and ones that had told me that who I was and who I knew I was shameful and something that I should be hiding at best and getting rid of if possible. And so I grew up that way for many, many years with both this, because I was out to myself pretty young. I remember being, 8 or 9 years old and being acutely aware of my own queerness, and certainly also my own ill fit within sort of traditional paradigms of boyhood gender. I did not feel comfortable in that box. I knew it was not one that fit my soul, my spirit. And I did not know what to do with that. And so as a result, I kind of ran away from myself, and I spent many years really numbing myself to who I was. There's a really wonderful line in Bell Hooks' book, The Will to Change, which is her book on masculinity, where she says that the first act of violence that patriarchy demands of men is not violence against women, but to kill off the emotional parts of the self.
Yeah.
And I remember the first time I read that, it just hit me like a lightning bolt, because it was exactly what I had lived through, that I went through all of these years and years and years getting so very good at killing off the parts of me that might hint at that wondrous, good, incredible person that God had created.
Yeah.
I got so practiced at numbing myself, at making myself unaware of all of those blessings that had been given to me from birth. And as much as I regret and lament those years I was lost to myself, I also recognize that journey of coming back into myself, of learning to cry again, of learning to feel again, of learning to be fully embodied and fully human, offered me a process that has then shaped a good chunk of my ministry and what I offer in communities, where I talk with folks who, may be 80 years old and share with me, oh yeah, I haven't cried in 60 years because, I learned so many messages about the ways that I was embodied that, that made me feel like my embodiment was wrong. And so I've been doing a lot of work both on myself, but also in community, of what does it look like to work with folks and walk with them on this journey of recovering and reclaiming the self and naming it good and holy. So that's sort of the first thing I know to be true, which is that we are all created good and wondrous and holy. And that unfortunately extends to all of my neighbors, even the ones who I don't always particularly care for in any given moment. I think that is another piece that I've really been sitting with particularly in these last, handful of years, is the reality that as much as my work oftentimes involves pushing back against cultural voices that I think do incredible harm, and particularly ones within the church that I think do incredible harm, I also need to affirm that those people are likewise created by God, good, holy, and wondrous, and that, it is all of our collective work to parse that difference between, people who are not acting out of that good, wondrous, beloved humanity that God has created for them. And how do we collectively move ourselves back to a place where we are acting out of alignment with those values, as opposed to, running up against them. Because the last sort of, pieces that I hold for myself is that the church has done so much harm to so many people who I love and care about. I used to be a minister at Middle Church in New York City, which is a very queer congregation.
Yes.
And we had so many people who would come and join the queer groups that I led and share with me the trauma that they experienced in churches, the trauma that they experienced at the hands of ministers, all of the ways that people put lies in God's mouth.
Yeah.
And I sit with that. And I also sat with this community that was offering life-giving theology to those same people. And so it's this tension between all of the ways that I know and have witnessed the grave harm that churches have done to people I love and care about, the ways that it harmed me, even though I didn't belong to those particular churches. And at the same time, I've witnessed and been part of the way that honest God talk, real, truthful testimony about how much God cherishes and loves queer people, and how much we belong not only in the church, but in all aspects of society, and how our love can shape and queer systems so that they are closer to the justice that every single one of us deserve. That story is so also powerfully alive, and these two sit next to each other. And I think it's all of our responsibility to negotiate those two truths in ways that don't erase one or the other. We can't just pretend that the queer theology and the beauty and the wonder and the goodness that churches do offer people every day is the only story, just as we can't pretend that the lies that have been told about God live in isolation and get to be the only and defining word about who queer people are. And so the last, testimony, the last truth I'll end with is that I know that resurrection is possible, that these death-dealing theologies, all of the ways that people are killed to themselves and to one another, is not the final word about who God is, and it's not the final word in our lives. Mm-hmm. I have lived that resurrection. I came back to myself after so many years of being numb to who I was, about lying to the people I loved most dearly, about who I felt myself to be, who I was attracted to, the ways that I understood my body and the ways that my body felt good in space. I was able to come out to all of my family and to my friends, and I've built wondrous queer community, and I live so much more abundantly now than that scared 12-year-old, 15-year-old, 18-year-old who trembled at the thought of the wondrousness that God had imbued in my spirit. I have come back to myself, and I believe so deeply that everyone, even the people who do grave harm, have that capacity to come back to themselves as well.
Oh, that was so beautiful. You do an excellent job of sharing your testimony, even though you haven't had the cultural practice. That is a beautiful, beautiful testimony. I want to start at the beginning. Because something that you said, I think, is very, very powerful. And that is that you did not grow up in a church that preached anti-LGBTQ rhetoric.
Yeah.
Yet, and you were just as oppressed by that rhetoric, despite being in a church that you saw doing positive things with respect to the LGBTQ community. It really speaks to how much louder that oppressive church voice has been than the affirming and celebratory church voice. Can you speak to that a little bit more?
Yeah, gladly. And it's interesting because as much as I never heard a homophobic sermon when I was growing up, the ways that my church affirmed and celebrated queer people were quiet. Yeah. So, for example, they ordained this gay man to be an elder in the church at a time when that wasn't allowed by church polity. And my minister really went out on a limb and could have been, defrocked for doing what was right, but chose to do it anyways. But it wasn't a big part of the vocal theology of the church. And so the church was quietly affirming of the queer people who were in the congregation, but wasn't contesting those loud public narratives that conservative theologians were so gleefully putting into the airwaves. And so I grew up knowing that those voices weren't really right, but they also were the only ones who I was hearing talking about queerness and God. Yeah. And I think part of that was just that my home pastor, as lovely and beautiful a man as he is, he's still alive and still doing wondrous, amazing things. I mean, somebody who I care deeply about and who represents for me some of the very best of what it means to be a minister. When he was in seminary, I'm sure he did not get a queer theology class. No. I'm sure that queer theologians were not on the syllabus. Right. And so as much as he felt that recognition that the queer folks in his congregation were every bit as deserving of leadership roles as anybody else, as much as he, certainly knew that kind of homophobic theology was wrong, he didn't have the tools to offer a robust theology of affirmation and celebration. And so that's a lot of what I do now in my professional work, is go to churches and do Bible studies, to do theological workshops, to walk with communities that are going through the process of becoming open and affirming, and helping them see and understand that there is a whole wealth of theological material out there that directly refutes the kinds of bigoted theologies that are put into God's mouth. That there are queer voices in the Bible speaking. They have been speaking since they were originally recorded, and they are not done speaking.
Right. And, to your point of your pastor not having those resources, I think we have to emphasize that those resources exist now. The seminaries exist, the classes, the syllabi, the books exist to access that queer theology and counter and take up that space that those anti-queer voices, because the only conversation about queerness and God, as you said, has been a very negative conversation. And we need a positive conversation to be happening. I think sometimes pastors are like, well, I'm not preaching anything bad from the pulpit. Okay, great. That was the floor. Now we need you to take a step further and preach something positive from the pulpit, right? We have to be,
Well, and
that's
people
what
act
affirming
like that this
is.
is some sort of surprise, that it's not a thing that we do regularly with all sorts of other groups of people. The church
Yes,
is regularly in the business of celebrating humans of all
yes,
stripes and walks, and of course, that's what part of why people should come to church is they should hear that good news that they were created by God as wondrous beings reflecting God's very image, that we carry within us that spark of divinity.
hmm
And it's not okay to say, okay, well, we're going to say that about 89% of the folks in the congregation, but that 11%, well, they're not going to hear a word of particular affirmation, because
there it
that
is.
is, again, the good news of the gospel is not that there is this amorphous, vague love that exists for us, but there's a particular love and affirmation of exactly who we are by a God who knows us and loves us and is working through us for collective transformation. Like that particular message of the gospel is crucial for everybody, not just queer folks,
Yeah.
but we need to be part of that whole.
Yes. Yes. Absolutely. Absolutely. Um, so you wrote a book,
I did.
which led to our opening question that I had for Ben. The book is called "Crybaby: Why Our Tears Matter." And so my first question for you is, why did you want to write this book, especially in this, I would say, social environment?
Yeah.
I think the idea of a male author talking about crying and the idea of it being vital to our well-being challenges certain notions that are being put out there that are feel as though they are taking over our culture, and that is, of hypermasculinity,
Mhm.
and men being as opposite of feminine as possible, which I don't know if they understand the way a circle works, but you're eventually going to work yourself back around. So tell our audience about what led you to writing this book in this moment.
Yeah, it's interesting. I never really set out to write a book about crying. I wrote an essay about crying for the Washington Post in the very beginning of the pandemic because I was living in Washington Heights in New York City, right next to Columbia Presbyterian Hospital. And I was watching as they were parking morgue trucks in the street in front of my house. And while I was watching those trucks fill with the bodies of my neighbors, I was listening to the news and hearing the, Donald Trump's and Governor DeSantis's of the world saying we need to get back to business. Like, this is too much of a fuss. We need to get back to normal. And it was this juxtaposition between what I was hearing and what I was literally seeing and weeping over outside my window that caused this spark of recognition. I was like, oh, I know this. This is what I lived through. That being so numb to one's feelings that you can watch literally thousands of neighbors dying without any kind of personal emotional encounter. yeah, I know that kind of numbness. And so I wrote this article talking about how I learned to cry again as a microcosm for what I thought we collectively needed to do in terms of our ability to feel and grieve and come to terms with the mass suffering that was unfolding around us.
Yeah.
And an editor reached out to me and asked if I wanted to write a whole book about crying. And I, at that point, had not really thought about it. But the more I thought about crying, the more I realized that crying is rarely just about crying.
Okay.
The tears are interwoven with all of these other social forces that I care about so deeply and that I love to write about sexuality and gender and race and power, and whose tears are afforded prominence and whose tears are cast aside and discarded.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized that crying could be this prism that I could talk about all of these things that I care about so deeply, and to infuse the kind of queer theology that I bring into my work into a larger cultural conversation that I think queer theology has a real voice at the table for, but oftentimes, we aren't invited to participate in larger, conversations about emotional health or conversations about, sexuality. And so I really wanted to bring the fullness of that witness to this topic of crying, which I think has never really gotten its due. If you Google books about crying, you'll find mine and, a couple of, more academic texts, but there are not a lot of books that really consider crying as a unique and particular practice. And so I wanted to talk about it as both a skill that we can develop, that we can, really work to develop emotional competency for ourselves and for the people we love, that we can change in the ways that I have changed and become a more full human being, but that also we need to deal with the ways that crying intersects all of these social forces that we would prefer, or some of us would prefer, to not look at directly. If I can share one little story.
Of course.
I was, as in the little intro, it said that I was on the BBC, and they had flown me out there, and I was on this show called The Best Medicine, where they were having people talk about, it's kind of a game showy fun thing where they bring on a handful of experts, and everybody comes on saying that you've got the best medicine, and then the hosts and the audience kind of vote, and they decide who has the best medicine. And so they had brought me on as the crying expert. And in the pre-show, when they were talking with the producers, one of the BBC producers had said, well, obviously, British people were very famous for not crying.
Yes.
Do you have any sense of why that would be? And I was like, well, yes, but I don't think you're going to like it. He said, what do you mean? And I said, well, for the bulk of several hundred years, the British Empire subjugated and enslaved and harmed and killed millions of people around the world. And if you're going to be in that line of work, empathy is a liability.
Yes.
That the kind of that tears and crying invite us to connect deeply with our neighbors, to recognize the way that our actions, that our very being and our humanity is interwoven with theirs.
Yes.
And if you want to be in the business of empire building, that is not useful. And so you see a cultural moment that is very shaped by this history of emotional negation, that you had generations and generations and generations of people who got very, very good at not feeling, because to feel would mean to come to terms with the magnitude of harm and suffering that they were perpetuating. And I think that, bringing that into this present moment, a lot of us need to get better at understanding the way that we feel, the way that our emotions are interwoven with other people's, and really dealing with the widespread harm that is happening every single day around this country because people are not taking other people's emotional lives into full account when they are conducting their own actions.
Wow. Okay, and now we understand why certain folks don't like empathy and don't want us to talk about it or share that or encourage that emotion in our young people. Because, like you said, empathy is antithetical to empire building, because empire building requires oppression, subjugation, and dehumanization, which,
we are right back in a moment of empire building. I don't know what's going to be happening in this country in May, but I know that here in January, we are at this weird intersection of, a president who feels very clearly that the U.S. hastily got out of the business of expanding our control over the Western Hemisphere and needs to get back at that. And I don't think that's at all disconnected from, like, as you say, the cultural voices on the right that say that empathy is a threat, that it's being, weaponized against young men. It is a recognition, in some ways, it's an apt recognition of the fact that, yes, actually, to be empathetic is a threat to those ways of being. That if we actually deal with the ways that our own emotional lives are intertwined with others, we will not be able to harm them in the kinds of ways that, this entire at this moment, Republican project is based on incredible harm to all kinds of communities. That if, you really felt the grievous suffering that, for example, migrant folks are experiencing in cities throughout the country right now, or in communities like my own, in rural Maine, that you would have to act differently. We would have to have an immigration system that would not treat people as if they weren't people.
Right. Our behavior. And so it would really change our behavior if we were in touch with our emotions, is what and the decisions that we make on a daily basis.
I don't think it's a coincidence that crying has been denigrated precisely because it is effeminized, that we, all sorts of things that are treated as a womanly art, for lack of a more genteel word, are treated as if they're not worthy of serious investigation, of serious consideration, and certainly aren't something that, young boys should be emulating. But I think that as long as we live in these siloed versions of humanity where to be a man, quote unquote, means that you need to kill off some of the most beautiful, wondrous parts of you that God created, we are never going to get whole and we are never going to get right.
And I think there's also, I think we can obviously take this even a step further. We denigrate crying in boys and young men, in men in general, but we also punish in many different ways women for showing the exact same emotion, publicly or not. Oh, she's hysterical. Oh, women can't lead because they cry too much. They're too emotional to be in positions of power, which is ludicrous, but nevertheless, we punish women or a female gender simply because we associate women with emotions. We associate women with crying. Go ahead.
What was so interesting to me in the process of writing this book is I interviewed, a couple hundred people about their crying experiences because I wanted the book to reflect many more stories than the ones that I carried within my own body, even though that was going to be a through line of the book. And what was so interesting to me was that folks across so many different, social locations expressed ambivalence, shame, fear, all these kinds of feelings about tears. There was this almost universal, reflexive shame that so many people experience. But the reason why people felt that shame was so particular. So you would have, men talk about, the ways that their grandfather had told them never to cry and how those stories lived in their bodies. You would have, as you say, women who would report to me that they were afraid that if they cried, particularly in a professional context, that they wouldn't be treated as professional or competent. I would talk with Black folks who would talk about the ways that, particularly crying in a predominantly white space, they feared that it would affirm people's racist caricatures of Black people as motivated by base passions and not intelligent, not capable. I would talk with the children of first generation immigrants who talked to me about how the world had never created a soft space for their parents, and so their parents were really clear with them that you need to be tough to survive. And that wasn't, even though they might be trying to raise their children differently now, that lesson from their parents, they don't look at as, something that was, expression of harm. It was an expression of care and love, that their parents knew that if they were going to make it in this world, they needed to be tough. And so there were all of these different ways that crying threads through what it means to be human and to come into contact with the systems of, domination and degradation and white supremacy that all of us live within. And so I think that, that's what was really interesting to me as I was writing the book, is I was seeing the way that those systems play out in myriad ways, but in particular ways across people's lives. And so that, yes, we are not all feeling shame for the same reasons, but there is a common shame, and that commonality is because we are all living in these systems that don't want us to be fully human.
Yeah. And can I say, though, that, and you mentioned in your testimony this idea of fear of, being our full selves,
Yeah.
and fear of what God created and called good, and
Yeah.
us being told to fear that. And I think similarly, we are taught to fear our own emotions or losing
Yep.
control of our emotions. And I think
Yep.
that point of losing control is different depending on who you are and the place that you are, of course.
Yep.
But I can speak like as a Black woman, I
Mm-hmm.
definitely have been hyper aware of what it means to be calm under
Yep.
pressure, and to not show emotion, and to just really compartmentalize it and lose it when I
Mm-hmm.
get home. I'm very good at that. I'm very good at not showing any of my cards, or doing
Yep.
a pretty good job. Maybe I'm not that great at it, because I'm a very sensitive person. I can admit that now, but it's always been presented to me as a skill, almost as an executive leadership skill, is this
Mm-hmm.
ability to overcome my natural sensitivity and preserve a sense of calm for everyone else, like in an effort to control everyone else's emotions.
Yep. Well, and it's this little, you know, this little price of death that you are being
Yes,
charged in every space that you are walking through.
yes,
That, in order to be yourself, it means being something other than yourself.
yes,
And what a tragic inheritance that all of us, and particularly, folks in marginalized social locations are living through, that we cannot simply go into a room and express the fullness of our humanity because we live in broader systems that treat that as a threat. And what's interesting, you rightly mentioned the way that intellectualization or emotional repression is lifted up as a sign of valor, as a sign of
yes.
sophistication, or mastery. And I use that word very intentionally.
Mm-hmm.
um, it's something that I confront a lot when I talk about queer theology, is because we've all inherited a theological tradition that has also aligned God with mind, with thought, with and then the body is aligned with sin and with earthliness
Yes,
and all the things
yes.
we need to cast aside and get beyond. We're taught to be suspicious of our emotions because that's the human part of us acting, whereas the brain, our logic, our mind, that's the voice of God. And I think that this idea that God only speaks to us through cognition is such a tragic inheritance of the Enlightenment, and a perversion of so much of what we see in, particularly Hebrew scriptures, where, this notion of a bodily incarnated God is so core to what it meant to be an ancient Judean person, understanding the way that God is speaking through, a collective people,
Yeah.
that like the ways that we are embodied reflect our holy wisdom. I mean, the fact that we worship an incarnated God, that we follow a Jesus who was not content to remain an idea but took corporeal flesh and walked among us, is a refutation of this idea that embodiment does not matter, that God does not speak to us through the ways that our body experiences the world. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that so many of us need to look back at the ways that we experience emotions, the ways that we are embodied, as the voice of God speaking through us, and not just the ways that we are able to think and reason. Yes, that is part of what it means to be created in the image of God, but our own embodiment, our corporeality, is the other part of that, and it has important things to teach us if we're willing to listen, to be curious about our tears, to be curious about our emotions, and to risk being changed.
And as you spoke about that, it reminded me that there is one place that I think tears are permitted. And I think that that is when your tears are brought on by the Spirit. So I was raised in a Pentecostal apostolic tradition, and even in the evangelical church, a tradition of speaking in tongues,
Yep.
being touched and moved by the Spirit, and the way that tears show up in that space. I'm also thinking of a particular TV preacher and his tears of remorse as he apologized on TV famously. So there are certain, in my mind I'm thinking, wait, there are certain tears that are allowed, and those are tears that are brought on by the movement of the Spirit. But that's still very, it's still very boxed in. It's in a very specific place under a very specific spirit. And I wonder if that has something to do with me being uncomfortable with being moved to tears by art and music when I'm outside of the church. If I am moved to tears by a song within a church, that feels absolutely natural and okay. Being moved to tears by a song or a piece of art outside of the church and feeling a spirit there, that feels suspect in some way. Now that you've got me thinking.
Well, yeah, it's interesting you're invoking. I'm assuming you're invoking Joel Osteen when you're talking about a TV
Oh
televangelist.
no, I was going even
Oh,
further back. I was going to Jimmy Swaggart.
oh
Yeah,
yeah, yeah,
I
yeah.
was thinking too.
I have a whole reflection of Joel Osteen crying because he's also very known to sort of cry publicly and
Yes, he does.
demonstratively.
Yes.
But I have a whole chapter on what I sort of term predatory vulnerability or aggressive vulnerability.
Okay.
But that's a whole sort of another thing to unpack.
Yeah.
But I mean, one of the things I will say about, particularly, Black church traditions is, how much of that is, Christianity and how much of it is, deeper ancestral Black spirituality. I mean, one of the things I talk about in the book is, the Ghanaian tradition of professional mourners, of professional weepers.
Yes.
You would hire people still very commonly. You'll hire women to come to the funeral and to weep histrionically and audaciously so that you create space so every single person can feel the enormity of that loss, can move through and testify to the fullness of who this person was when they were alive and the sorrow that they are no longer with us.
Yes.
And I think so many Black church traditions, communal weeping, certainly to name one of them, reflect, yes, a particular Christian tradition, but they also reflect a more ancestral African traditions that were brought to the Western Hemisphere by people and then syncretized with Christianity and have now sometimes found a uncomfortable home within a Christian tradition that is not always comfortable with their existence.
Yeah.
And I think that, that's again something I heard oftentimes when I was talking with Black folks for the book is the way that, many people reported experiences of communal weeping, which were very different than, the white folks who I spoke with.
Okay.
That almost I can't think of a white person I spoke with for the book who was frequently around large groups of other white people crying. Wow. And I will certainly say that as a white person who cries pretty regularly, you were asking at the beginning, when was the last time you cried? Yeah. I cried last night.
Okay.
I cry most days.
Okay.
But I can't ever think of being, even at funerals, certainly, perhaps the immediate family of the person who died would be crying, but not a collective experience of mourning and weeping. All of the experiences that I have had being part of a collective body that was weeping in mass were almost exclusively either like protest spaces led by Black folks or, predominantly Black spaces.
Wow.
And I think that is a real gift that, the Black culture has to offer as a corrective to a white society that, for reasons that I, went into before, has produced a deadening effect in the lives of people. And it's a real shame that instead of, folks like yourself needing to come into a space and think, oh, how can I, kill off those parts of my humanity for this 2-hour window so that I appear the way that I'm supposed to appear to be taken as professional, could instead bring the fullness of your humanity as a corrective to spaces that are not beneficial to anyone, white folks very much included. Again, getting back to this, everybody is created in the image of God, even people who, commit harm on a regular basis. Part of the corrective of bringing people back into encounter with that good, wondrous humanity that God created them with is, needing to unsettle and shake up these spaces that have been shaped by forces that do not want us to be whole.
And I would definitely say that if I brought my full self into certain spaces, it would definitely shake them up. That's that's a scary proposition.
And I understand why you don't.
Yeah.
I don't want anybody listening here to be like, Benjamin Perry says you're a bad person if you code switch. I understand. Yeah. And I am certainly as guilty as anybody else of code switching when I go into places. But I also want us to grieve what that means.
Right. Yes. Oh, I think that is such a good way of framing that. Let's be realistic about the necessity of code switching. It provides safety, emotional, physical, psychological safety, and we can still grieve the necessity of code switching, particularly in our faith spaces.
World.
Yeah.
Like, we all live in this world and we need to go negotiate it with open eyes. And at the same time, if we're Christians, when we believe in this, not yet, but already, like, that's part of that is how can we begin to unsettle these, cultures of death with little bits of resurrection?
Yeah.
What does it mean to, maybe we can't go there all the way, but, when I walk into a church and I'm doing a training, that's one of the first things I'm sussing out is how far can I push them? How far can I push people to be uncomfortable in ways that are life-giving? And I know that if I misjudge that and I go way too far, that people are going to shut down and they're not going to listen to me and they're not going to engage and they're not going to engage with themselves. And this is not me saying that I have all the answers or anything, but, I'm being brought in to do a queer theology training and, and I'm trying to understand, okay, well, where are people and how far can I make them uncomfortable in ways that are still generative and will help them sort of move out of some of the ruts that their faith may have been put into by no fault of their own. I walk into a lot of churches and I'm, talking with 75-year-olds who will say to me honestly, I really want to understand how the Bible asks us and invites us to celebrate queerness. And, I want to have a different kind of relationship with my queer grandchild. And I don't understand how.
Yeah.
I was brought up to believe all of these things to be true about God and the Bible, and I need help. And it's not particularly helpful to come in and say, well, you need to get rid of everything you believe. Like that's not how any of this works. Right. But what we can do is we can come in with love and say, you know what, let's talk about this. Let's start where you are and let's encounter some different kinds of theology that you were not shown. And let's walk together towards different kinds of understanding. Also opening, I have changed in the 5 years that I've been doing this kind of work with congregations here in rural Maine. I have changed.
Yeah.
Like rural Maine has changed me just as much as I have gone in and changed, congregations and helped them to understand new ways of being. Like I have also learned new ways of being. I was, I grew up most of my life in New York City and was, a particular kind of way. And I am not exactly that person anymore 5 years later after living here in a very different kind of place. And I think that openness to transformation is part of what all of us need to be bringing in, regardless of the spaces we occupy, regardless of, the kinds of work that God is calling us to, whether it's, work in a church or anywhere else. How can we be as full a version of ourselves as we are able to safely be? And how can we invite other people into a space of transformation, knowing that we will also be changed in the process?
Oh, just absolutely beautiful. Reverend Ben, I could sit and talk to you for hours, I think, because now I want to get all into rural Maine, but we'll have to let you go for this episode. Just know we're going to be calling again. We want to hear more. And I think there's still more about crime to talk about, too. There's still so much more there
Absolutely.
to unpack. But thank you so much for sharing your testimony with us and at least getting us started on this amazing conversation. So we are going to jump right into our two segments, the first of which is the query of the day. Yes, it's a pun. And today's query is, when was the last time you cried? And was it a happy cry? Was it a sad cry? Or was it a mad cry? I love a good mad cry. That's, I think I go there a little bit too often, but that's our query of the day. Let us know. Leave us a comment wherever you're listening to this episode, or on Instagram. Are you following Coming Out Christian on Instagram? You should be, and all of your friends should be. Please let us know. When's the last time you cried? Was it a sad cry, a happy cry, or a mad cry? And for our second segment, it is time for our moment in queer history, because we have always been here in our beautiful, fabulous, glorious selves. Ben?
Instead of a moment in queer Christian or queer history, I want to address a kind of a place. And it's a place that it's actually the place that Ben and I met. And Ben referenced it as he was talking, and that's Middle Collegiate Church in New York City. Middle was founded as part of the Collegiate Churches of New York roughly around 1628. It was a part of the original Dutch church in what was then New Amsterdam, and of course became New York later on. But so it's been around for almost 400 years at this point. The Middle specifically, while the collegiate churches are relatively progressive, if not very progressive at this point, Middle is probably the most progressive, or has been for kind of a longer period. Always a church, or at least in more recent history, always a church that was very welcoming to the queer community, that was welcoming, particularly in more recent memory, to multi-ethnic, multi-racial, multi-generational communities. And a place that has always, well, again, in more recent memory, has always been very inclusive of the arts community. So a lot of Broadway folks, a lot of artists, a lot of creative folks in general, and somewhere that has been not only inclusive, affirming, but as Ben well said, has celebrated those folks in ways that goes well beyond affirming and including, but really lifting up those different identities and celebrating them for who they are as individuals, but also collectively. It was the church that I found when I was pretty well ready to cast off Christianity and never look back. And it was definitely the church that got me to see that, yes, there is a place for, not only is there a place for queer Christians in the church, but there's a place for queer people who want to ask questions and want to debate and know that not only do the people in the pews around them also have questions, and also have very deep questions, but the clergy does too. And just an absolutely wonderful church. Again, place that Ben and I met, that I was a member of for quite a number of years, and remains a very, very, very good community, and a community that's very close to my heart. So again, Middle Collegiate Church in New York, there are, I believe, still 2 or 3 other collegiate churches that make up what was originally just this one church. If you're in New York City, I would definitely encourage you to check out Middle. If you're someone who follows progressive Christianity and queer Christianity, and some of those sources, you may have encountered the Reverend Dr. Jackie Lewis. Jackie is the wonderful and incredible senior minister at Middle. So just a really, really awesome place, really good place.
If I could just jump in super quickly, I was not ready. I was not expecting to know anything about the queer history thing, but this actually a subject that I know quite a bit about. But one of the things, just in light of our conversation, that's so interesting to me about Middle is that Middle was a congregation that for a very long time was not a progressive church. If you go back and, the fact that it was founded in 1623 should give you a little hint about some of the history the church was part of, but it was very much complicit in the theft of the island of Manhattan from the Lenape people. Several of the ministers at Middle personally enslaved people. And it's now a church that is led by this bold, dynamic Black pastor who, in so much of what she does, unsettles and charts new territory for, what does it mean to be a church where everybody belongs?
Yeah.
And I think that that's part of what is really beautiful to me about Middle is not just its current iteration, but the fact that in its very DNA, it carries this promise that places can change, that people can change, that our history does not confine us, that our future can be something different.
Ah, such a wonderful thing to remember. Thank you both for today's moment in queer Christian history. Well, that brings us to the end of another wonderful episode. Thank you again to Reverend Benjamin Perry for being our amazing guest today. Is there anything that you would like to promote, social media? Of course, the book. Please tell us the title again.
The title of the book is Cry, Baby, Why Our Tears Matter. It's comma after cry.
Okay.
It's a little invitation from me to you. But I can be found on socials at FaithfullyBP, Instagram, I guess Twitter still technically. I'm on Substack under Benjamin Perry. I will be honest that I've been on social media less and less of late.
Yeah.
So you can find me there, but it's a little quiet. If you want to find me more active, one of the things that I want to share with this audience, because I think you might enjoy it, is Garrett Seminary, where I work, just launched a resource called the Garrett Collective, which is this incredible digital library for theological education. And so there's all kinds of prayers and webinars and liturgies and micro courses and cohorts and all kinds of things that you can participate wherever you live in the world. You can download resources to your device, but it's a beautiful sort of Netflix style platform for theological content. And it's just really beautiful. I've added some prayers and things that you can find from me there too.
That's amazing. Love to hear about more resources. I can just hear
GarrettCollective.org.
Okay, GarrettCollective.org. I saw Ben's eyes light up. He's excited to go jump in. I think I'm excited to go jump in. So thank you so much for sharing that resource with our audience. And audience, get out there. Check out the Garrett Collective. Remember to like, to subscribe, to tell a friend, and then join us next Sunday for Coming Out Christian.
Thanks so much for joining us today. We hope this conversation encouraged you, challenged you, and maybe just helped you feel a little less alone on your journey. If this podcast has been meaningful to you, would you consider supporting the work of Love Boldly? Love Boldly's mission is to create spaces where LGBTQIA+ people can flourish in Christianity, and your donation helps make conversations like this one possible. You can give at www.loveboldly.net/donate. That's www.loveboldly.net/donate. Want to stay connected with the podcast? Follow us on Instagram at comingoutchristian_podcast for updates, resources, and community. Until next time, remember that you can be queer and Christian and queer.